This is George Butler. Welcome to our program. I'm here along with my co-host,
Charlotte Littlefield Brown.
We have a fine guest this evening. He's from the Middle East Institute in downtown Washington, D.C. His name is Dr. Iqbal. Welcome to our program, Dr. Iqbal.
Thank you.
And Dr. Iqbal was with the IMF for 35 years. Is that correct, sir?
That's right.
And what was your last time you did service with the IMF?
Well, I retired as Assistant Director of the Middle East Department in October last year.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
You feel like you're still working, don't you?
Well, it's very difficult to kick the old habit.
Yes, 35 years. That's a very long time to be looking at these type of economic and world problems. Okay, sir, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for welcoming us to your beautiful home, and thank you for taking the time to do this interview with us. Let's start with the current credit crisis. We're having the Washington D.C. just concluded 2 days of the G-20 plus China or plus Russia, various diplomats, about 1,000 people coming together in the, what was that, the International, the building was the National Building Museum.
Building Museum, that's
Yes,
right.
yes, a very gorgeous building to conduct this, to start talking about the global implications of this crisis that seems to be brewing, and apparently it's going to be something we have to face for a few years to come now. So why has this global crisis happened, sir?
Well, it has been in the making for quite some time. Mm-hmm. But underlying the problem is that there was excessive buildup of external deficits in some of the countries, and counterpart excessive surpluses in other countries. As the credit demand in countries, deficit countries, particularly like the United States, increased, the credit became available at relatively cheap terms. Interest rates remained low because, first of all, inflation was low. Number two, the surpluses, global surpluses, were so large that it was possible to finance the increasing demand for credit at very low interest rates, which meant that there was increasing attraction to use the credit irresponsibly. So quite a bit of that happened in terms of, for example, as you have already heard about the mortgage lending that took place under rather, I should say, irresponsible terms. And the buildup of that credit created a situation where major banks acquired large amounts of financial assets whose net worth or real worth was less than the market worth. In the process, there was decline in confidence in the ability of these institutions to be able to handle their emerging liabilities while their assets were not as valuable as nominally implied. So the consequence was a mismatch between the asset and liability sides of the balance sheets. In the process, there were a number of institutions which were unable to meet their emerging commitments. When that happened, the confidence crisis deepened. Many of the banks started to have stress because they were unable to meet their obligations, while at the same time the credit growth continued to take place, while the assets underlying those credit, those loans were becoming poorer. As the borrowers are unable to repay, the value of those assets for which they had borrowed fell, and when that happened, the asset position of the banks deteriorated. That's the fundamental principle underlying
Dr. Iqbal, how did these derivatives play into this? Were they a major factor in the problems that the banks have today? Is there a big overhang of derivatives that are some worthless or?
Well, you see, derivatives is just a very fancy name for a simple certificate that allows you to be able to transact certain transactions. They are based on existing assets. They are not creating new assets. They are just, what I should say, a claim on the existing assets. They have to be transacted in the market. They're supposed to be short-term so that they they can, as they say it, operate the process in the market whereby the arbitrage takes place. So any differential between the market price and the notional price can be taken care of through the derivatives. So
you seem to indicate earlier in your earlier comments that some of the assets on the books of financial institutions are not worth what they were in the past. Is this the problem then?
Very much so.
Are some of these institutions insolvent at this time and just trying to pay their bills? Is this what this?
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons why institutions like the Merrill Lynch declared bankruptcy.
I see.
This is nothing unusual. It's just that it has happened on a very large scale. Banks do run into these difficulties. They do go through bankruptcies. They disappear. They're taken over by others, like any other operation.
Do you think that the character of the transnational, of the financial corporations on the transnational, did that flow into this? I mean, did that create a bigger problem because they were able to invest from all over the world in these so-called securities, or in essence derivatives in some cases?
Yes and no.
Okay.
No, in the sense that in a global economy which is completely integrated, movement of capital is going to take place from places where there are surpluses to places where there are shortages.
Right.
Because the returns are higher where the shortages exist. It's inevitable. That will happen. It's a natural course of action which should take place. That's the only way the economies grow. However, if these assets are not used effectively, if these surpluses which come from one part of the world to another part of the world, or from one institution to another institution, if these surpluses or these flows are not used well, in other words, where the return is lower than the cost, then you're going to have difficulties. This is it's a very natural kind of a thing. It's a very simple fundamental principles of economics, where if you are unable to generate returns which are at least equal to or higher than the cost, you're going to run into difficulties. And that's what seems to have happened. It's nothing to do, or I wouldn't say nothing, but not much to do with the fact that there was a transnational movement of capital. Reason being that this has been going on for the last 50 years, in fact 60 years. In 1944, when the Bretton Woods Conference took place, at that stage the idea was that gradually there will be a movement towards full capital convertibility, as we call it, and that took place over time. By the 1970s, it was very much in the place, and today, in fact, global economy has more capital account convertibility than current account convertibility. Current account convertibility relates to payments for imports and exports, etc., etc. There are restrictions on imports and exports, but there are very few restrictions on movement of capital.
Now when we say this movement of capital, we have what, China with over $1 trillion worth of reserves. Is that correct? How is that going to be handled, and can we handle that?
Yeah, certainly.
Now the Western nations, are they organizing together under the umbrella of this latest meeting here in Washington D.C. to try to implement some kind of action? Or would it be a regulatory type of approach, or what?
Well, it remains to be seen. At this moment, we have only a very broad outline of how things will be handled. The broad outline is not a bad outline at all. I mean, under the circumstances, with the kind of difficulties and constraints we are encountering on a global level as well as within the countries, it's a reasonably good movement.
What on this outline that they've come up with? What parts of that outline would you agree with, and where would you disagree with some of the proposals that they've come up with on it?
I think the proposals are so broad that you really cannot disagree with them. But that's what happens when you
begin a process.
When you have summits of heads of state.
Yes, I see.
It's inevitable that
they don't want to obligate themselves on too much of a detailed level.
They
right?
shouldn't.
That's for their assistance to effect later.
They should not.
They set major strategy and policy.
They provide the political support that is needed to start the process of bringing together the world decision makers to find a solution which will be acceptable to everyone. Because if it is not acceptable to certain segments of the global society, it will not work. So you have to bring in everybody. Now, that doesn't mean that the whole process will dilute the very recommendations of what needs to be done. It's just that these people, these heads of state, having committed themselves in general terms to addressing the issues and the problem, they have now set the stage for more specific and more substantive things to happen. I think they all very fully recognize that the financial institutions, being transnational, as you said, need a better and a more coordinated process of regulation and supervision. That doesn't mean that they should be restricted. What it means is they ought to be subject to more rigorous and standardized regulatory practices. At this moment, countries differ from each other.
And this, sir, would be, for example, the IMF has allowed, or not allowed, but there was an evolution of flexible free market exchange rates. And so what you're talking about, this regulation would make sure that there's not predatory practices between countries that are well capitalized and those that have a surplus, those that have deficits.
Yeah, there should be a more even movement of surpluses to the deficit countries, and that they're handled on market-based prices. And so what it really boils down to.
Okay, and and how that would translate to the United States is we happen to be a deficit country?
Well, I think underlying all this is that the United States has been a deficit country for much too long. Mm-hmm. Now, for a period of time, and in fact until very recently, there was no problem of that because the US dollar is a reserve currency, is the reserve currency in the world. And countries were quite willing to accept it and hold it as reserve.
Right.
It was perfectly fine. The problems emerge when the market perceives, the global market perceives that the amount of deficits being generated are excessive. Excessive in the sense that down the road, it's going to cause a decline in the value of that particular currency, in this case the US dollar. So if they are keeping their assets, their surpluses in dollars, they want to protect its value.
Do you think, in your opinion, Dr. Iqbal, that there might be a default by the United States on some of their debt or not?
No.
They'll roll it over and recast it, or well, how do you think we're going to handle that debt?
The way it's going to happen is the following. There is going to be a reallocation of the global surpluses. There will be a transfer of global surpluses to countries which have got deficits. And the United States is one of those. It's in the interest of the world economy and the countries who are holding these surpluses to make sure that the United States continues to grow. This is the largest economy in the world. It's the largest importer in the world. Mm-hmm. It is one place which is acting as what you may call the linchpin of the global system. So nobody is about to create a situation where they will, quote unquote, shoot them on the foot themselves.
Okay, so we'll get home tonight, we'll have gasoline, right?
Basically what it means is that there will be an adjustment.
Yes.
It's inevitable.
Yes.
That the US system over time will change.
Do you think the dollar will come down in some, will there be a revaluation of the dollar in corresponding to other currencies?
But remember, the US dollar has appreciated quite significantly in the last 6 months.
Yes, it has against the
euro.
The euro, yes, it has come back somewhat.
Essentially because people have had greater confidence in the U.S. economy.
Now, let me ask you this: about do we still use the international dollar to settle oil debts, by purchases and sales?
Of course.
So we need a certain amount of credit in dollars still. Is that correct?
Oh yes. But this is
and so does that take up some of this? The oversupply of dollars or the overcreation somewhat?
It's very difficult to say whether it's the oversupply of dollar.
Yeah.
You will recognize.
We're talking about credit here, really, right?
It only happens when people are not willing to accept the dollar, the going exchange rate.
Okay.
That would then imply that there's an oversupply.
Right.
At this moment, the dollar is appreciating. And that is because there are a large number of institutions who are unwinding their forward positions and they need the dollars to settle those positions. Down the road, what will happen is difficult to tell. I would assume that there will be some degree of backward movement in the US dollar. Some degree. How much it is, we don't know.
You think 20, 30% maybe? Or?
No, I don't think so. Not that much. There will be some adjustment that will take place inevitably because the rest of the world is going to slow down. When the global economy slows down, there is going to be a decline in demand for the U.S. products.
Well, yes, sir. That's
Right.
that's great.
Now,
Right.
in your opinion, there's what's developing out of this crisis worldwide is a new umbrella organization of some kind. Is it going to be headed up by the IMF or the Federal Reserve? Is the Federal Reserve taking a lead somewhat on this? But will the IMF be one of the lead organizations in the end to be at the top of this whole international restructuring?
Well, let me put it this way. It's inevitable that you have to have an international body to bring countries together. If you didn't have IMF right now, you'll have to create one. So under those circumstances, I would expect the IMF's role increasing down the road rather than declining. What's going to happen is the following. There is going to be a closer coordination among the regulatory authorities and the lending authorities. Lending authority in this case is the International Monetary Fund. Regulatory authority is the Forum for Stability, the FSF. Now, increasingly, the FSF is going to be given greater responsibility to coordinate regulatory practices to make sure that the major banks in the world, which are basically all multinational banks, that they start to adhere to the standardized rules of regulation and supervision. Because then that will protect against the same thing ever happening again, where the banks acquire assets which lose their value and they overlend, thus create problems for their capital.
Let me ask you another question, Dr. Iqbal. In this consolidation or whatever we're headed, do you see a threat to our individual freedoms or liberties at all worldwide? Or how can those be protected in this new consolidation and concentration of regulation?
Well, this regulation is going to be on the institutions, not on individuals. The problem has been what we call in economics moral hazard. Moral hazard basically implies unequal information. And those who have better information then tend to exploit those who have less information. What will happen down the road is that institutions which had more information than the others will now have to adhere to the same rules. And therefore, a larger number of institutions will have the same information. And therefore, I would expect that down the road, moral hazard will actually decline rather than increase.
And when we talk about, Dr. Iqbal, about information, in March of 2006, the Fed quit reporting M3. Now, what was that about?
That's very minor.
Huh?
I mean, that's a very minor issue.
You think so?
Yeah, because M3, remember that M3 really does not enter the picture when it comes to defining the monetary policy objectives.
But were they expanding the money supply at the time to keep everything solvent? Is that what was going on?
Not really. I don't think so. What I would say is the following, that what was happening was that the economy was growing at a certain pace. And that pace had, if you needed to sustain that pace, you needed more credit growth in the system. It was at that stage, the conflict between inflation and growth was such that there was a sense, look, you can grow a bit more without creating inflationary pressures. And therefore, if there's more credit, that's fine. But remember, when you get into a situation where inflation starts to become an issue, then credit will be contracted, or growth will be restrained. That never appeared in the case of the United States. And the reason partly was, as I explained earlier, there was such a large amount of surplus abroad, which was being transferred to the United States. And therefore, the base for generating credit existed. If, however, there were less surpluses abroad and smaller deficits in the United States, then the monetary base, as you call it, would have been smaller. And then growth in credit would have been also relatively smaller. So the whole thing goes back to the idea, if you have persistently large and growing current account deficits in your balance of payments, you are going to have a situation where there will be very large surpluses abroad. Where are they going to go with those surpluses? This is a major growing economy. So they were putting this money back here. Down the road, what will have to happen is, if you have large surpluses, they will have to be converted into real assets. In other words, countries like China, Japan, the oil producers in the Middle East, they will have a very large amount of dollar assets in their hands. They will then like to balance between what we call the monetary assets and the real assets. They're likely to go for more real assets than monetary assets because of the conditions that exist. Number one.
So tangibles, you're saying people are going to be moving into to more tangibles away from paper. Is that it?
Particularly countries that have got surplus.
And that's wise to do. Would
Yes,
that would be good advice for even the property owner?
Very
whatever.
sensible. Very sensible. The property owners, see, this has been a very serious problem, and I think everybody recognizes it. In the United States, mortgage lending, became very irresponsible.
Yes.
And this acted as a catalyst to what we see today. If there was sufficient degree of restraint on mortgage financing, we wouldn't have been facing the problem today. In other words, what I'm saying is, this is the last straw that broke the back of the camel. If it hadn't happened, the monetary managers, the monetary policy authorities would have recognized over time that there are problems emerging and that they can be handled. It became more difficult to handle because there was a massive amount of non-performing mortgage loans out there.
Do you think, Doctor, that the deregulation that occurred starting in the 70s during the Nixon administration and Kissinger, and it proceeded on into the 80s and 90s, especially in the financial sector, do you think that has been a major contributing factor to this problem today?
Look, it's in the eye of the beholder, believe it or not. Because in order to be able to make that kind of judgment, one will have to undertake a very concise, thorough analysis. I have heard of this. I have not seen any analysis being done, because what you need to do then is undertake a counterfactual analysis whereby you'll have to say, if this hadn't happened, if this deregulation hadn't taken place, where would we have been? Deregulation in itself is not a bad thing. It's how it is handled that's the bad thing. Why should a bank be so irresponsible so as to extend credit for a house where the borrower doesn't even have income that would justify him to buy that house? It's the irresponsibility
they were
of the
doing
bank.
some low doc loans, I believe, where
Right.
they were accepting the statements on the loan application by the potential borrower without double checking and seeing if they had the ability. But one of the basic cardinal rules is to verify a person can repay that loan, right?
Now, that is not deregulation.
Now, let me ask you this. We're seeing reports in all the news, all the mainline news and so forth, up and down, all over the country, and they seem to concentrate in this mortgage area of these subprime lending and these abuses, But there were many other types of securities like we spoke about earlier. Didn't they far outweigh in dollar amount, though, the mortgage sector itself, or not?
Yes, but you see, they did. I mean, they're in trillions of dollars.
Yes,
I agree.
yes.
But remember that nobody was concerned about those till such time that one other aspect of the balance.
Wire, you're saying like the straw that broke the camel's back in this case is they surfaced and became very public.
More than that. You see, what happened was that those derivatives and other instruments could have been managed if the institutions had enough of leeway in their balance sheets and their capital had been safe. But because of the problems on the mortgage market, they didn't have that.
Then that took them into a problem area on their books, and to reconcile those,
the flexibility was lost.
Then they had to start seeking a greater liquidity. First, the liquidity preceded the credit. Now we're into a credit.
Yeah. Now we have a credit squeeze because everybody is scared to lend, and for that matter, people would rather protect their savings.
So they're not lending to one another. So interbank lending.
The interbank lending just shut up because the banks did not know what was in the other banks'
Well,
balance sheets.
is LIBOR an indication of that interbank lending out of London, or what is the best indicator from that you follow?
Good God.
Huh?
We're
getting some good things here, Doug.
There is no such thing as one common indicator.
As one good indicator.
No,
you have to look at
a lot of things.
Large number,
And that's
full
the
of
reason.
things.
So that's the reason why we ran into trouble, because we were focusing only on a very few elements.
I see.
And we felt as long as they're doing fine, things would be okay. For example, the general presumption was we have kicked the inflation, so why worry about it? What they didn't realize was that while the consumer inflation didn't go up much, there was a massive increase in the prices of housing as well as stock market.
Yep.
Yes.
So there was the surpluses of liquidity were going into that area. But when they got saturated, that's where the problems started to happen. You see? So when we say inflation was not a problem and therefore we could go on the way things were, that's where we ran into trouble, because it was based on the experience of the past, not the analysis of the future.
I see.
Speaking of the future, how are we going to stop this from getting worse globally?
Well, I think this is the summit was a good beginning for that. At least it has identified three very broad areas where work needs to be done. And if that work is done, I think we will be able to proceed well. And one of those is, look, this is not the time to restrain economic growth. Because if you were to restrain economic growth, then you'll get into the same kind of crisis that it happened in the 1930s. It will just deepen the recession without solving the problem. So in other words, countries will need to spend more. And given the fact that interest rates are already so low, you cannot reduce interest rates any further to be able to generate that spending. That has to come from the fiscal side, from the budgets. They will have to borrow. And maybe surplus countries will finance it. At this moment, they shouldn't really be too worried about the fiscal deficits, really, for that reason, because inflation is not really picking up. In fact, there's a greater fear of deflation than of inflation, so you can continue with more aggressive fiscal policy and be able to maintain it. Second, they have to significantly improve and consolidate regulation of the banking institutions on a globalized basis. And in this, it's not simply a question of banks established in the United States or Europe, but all over the world. Because the banking system has become completely integrated. A bank in Timbuktu will feel the impact of something happening in the United States and vice versa. Of course, the bank in Timbuktu is too small to have a major impact, but the reverse is not the case. So it's very important that regulatory practices become standardized, more rigorous, and should be carried out in a very transparent fashion so that everybody knows that the moral hazard issue has been taken care of. The third issue is, how do you finance the recovery of developing countries, especially of the emerging markets, which have been hurt? See, the way the system has worked is the following. There is the first order effects and the second order effects. The first order effect is the immediate effect of the weakening of the balance sheets of the commercial banks and the failure of commercial banks in the United States and Europe, especially in the UK. Now, these banks had interactions and participation with banks in the rest of the world. As their balance sheets go bad, the balance sheets of those banks also go bad. So an immediate effect is weakening of the balance sheets of the commercial banks in the rest of the world. And that means their ability to lend declines. And the governments have to then come in and help them to stave any further crises. So that's the first order condition, which then has an impact, immediate impact on growth in the economy. The second order effect is a much more significant effect, because that's a longer term effect. And that effect is that as the economy slows down in the developed countries' ability to grow declines, as well as their ability to finance growth in other countries declines. So the movement of capital becomes smaller, foreign direct investment contracts, so the growth tends to fall in the whole world. That's a more serious issue. At this moment, what the summit did was that it looked at how do you address the immediate problem, then looked at what will have to be done in the future to protect against the same thing from happening, and that was through the regulatory practices and standardization of regulation and more transparent, rigorous regulation of banking institutions. The third issue was how do you protect the rest of the world from falling into trouble? And that's where large amount of funding or loans by institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank become very important. The question now is, how are you going to provide resources for these institutions so that they can increase their lending operations? Now, there are basically only three areas from where these funds can come at this moment. China with large surpluses, Japan with surpluses, and the oil producers in the Middle East in particular. Remember, if they provide resources to these institutions, and these institutions own land, and therefore countries in the rest of the world, the emerging markets, maintain their level of growth, then they'll be able to pull countries like the United States and others with them. For example, the latest information is, and this is the IMF forecast that came out last week. It said that in 2009, the industrial countries or the developed countries are going to grow by less than 0.1%. In reality, they will not grow. I mean, in fact, some of the countries will have a negative growth.
Just a flat,
Not even flat. I mean, some of the countries are going to have a negative growth.
I see.
A small contraction, which means that there will be a recession.
No major contraction, but no real growth.
No, there will be no growth.
Okay.
No growth.
Okay.
But if system works the way we expect it to work, the emerging market economies in the rest of the world will grow at about 4.5 to 5%.
Wow.
And if that happens, they'll be able to sustain the global economy. That's the reason why lending by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank becomes so important. Because there is no way to transfer resources to these countries directly. Reason being, for these countries, I'll give you an example of my own country. Pakistan has just signed an agreement with the International Monetary Fund to receive close to $8 billion for a 2-year period against a comprehensive adjustment program. That program requires Pakistan to do certain things which will speed up the process of better resource allocation and therefore growth, and protect against the balance of payments problems that it had started to run into. They are going to do the same with many other, Ukraine, Hungary, and there are several other countries that are coming in later on. What will happen is that these economies will be in a position to sustain their level of growth because they'll have these funds available, so they will not have to worry about their external imbalances. That's what will provide the global economy with the needed fillip for them to grow. And that's why this third component is quite critical. It hasn't been fully articulated yet. And that's to be expected because this is something that's to be worked out by the representatives of the various countries who will now start to work for the next 4 to 6 months to put together the whole package. I would assume by August next year, we should have a very well-defined blueprint, a detailed blueprint of where we are going and how the global monetary system will have changed.
There seem to be some indications at the end of this summit that some of the nations, well, I think Russia was one of them, were looking towards Obama. Is that a factor in this also? when he takes office? And how will his policies, in your opinion, differ from what Bush has started in today's
well, I guess we'll have to wait.
summit meeting?
We'll have to wait and see. As Mr. Obama said, I think it was a very succinct statement. He said there can be only one president in the United States at any one time. So he would defer to President Bush to take decisions. When you get into summits like this, you have already worked out your internal compromises and consensus have been developed. Not only in the United States, but elsewhere as well.
So every nation that attended this summit,
they
came to the table with certain, that we'll go this far but no further, and
Yes.
we'll entertain these lists
Yes.
of compromises, but
Yes.
no
Yes.
more. Is
Yes.
that
Yes.
okay?
Yes.
And so there's a team effort there at these conferences.
Oh, very much
and,
so.
And so they have all these. How large an entourage do some of these nations bring with them?
There was 1,000.
Do they have to have limousines as far as the eye can see?
We saw a lot of diplomatic plates.
Unless you're driving around in a limousine, you ain't nothing up here.
Well, you see, but remember one thing, that the work of the technicians, or what we call Sherpas, had been going on for several months.
Mm-hmm.
And what you saw yesterday and today was the culmination of the Sherpas' work. They had already done the work. These people, these heads of state, basically provided the political cover that was needed for them to go on any further. Quite a bit of work has already been done, as a matter of fact. Quite a bit of concrete work has already been done. And that was the basis for this agreement. More will be done in the future. And I'm quite confident, having seen the way things were done in the 70s when the Second Amendment went through for the Articles of Agreement for the International Monetary Fund. This will work.
I'm sorry, I have a question. Obviously, being with the IMF for 35 years, you work on a very high level, macro economics. The economics feels a lot different at the micro level.
Yes.
And how, when a person needs a loan, or they think that they are saving money. Like, for example, my personal experience. I thought I was going into a dollar system where I would, work a certain way, save money, use that money to buy my house, use that money to buy my car. I find myself in a position where I can't do that. I have to get a loan in order to get my $30,000 car, and I don't have a $30,000 car, but or whatever.
I understand.
And then also the concept, like my parents, they paid their house off in like 5 years. They saved. They actually used the dollars. They didn't go into a 30-year mortgage loan that they paid the house off for a long duration of time. So economics, or I should say the monetary system, feels different at the micro level.
Right.
How that... the idea, I think there's a lot of people that are concerned that with these large institutions and these global efforts to coordinate and regulate and get everything more balanced and to make sure the capital and money continues to flow on a global scale, that the little people are going to be left out in this in some capacity. These regulations and such. Now, I understand that what happened in the mortgage market, obviously, if somebody's income wasn't even verified, this is a lending practice problem, and that's unacceptable. But what would you say to ordinary people in the United States, in Pakistan, in other countries? What can we expect on the micro level? How this macro system, how is it going to affect us on the micro?
With a lag.
With a lag. Can you explain that, please?
Well, initially things will get worse before they get better. That's inevitable. That's unfortunately the way the system works. When there is a disequilibrium and a correction takes place, somebody loses. Okay? In this case, it looks like that the consumers will lose. The reason why the consumers will lose is because the consumers were under the assumption that their assets are going up in value, and therefore they don't have to save, because the savings are already there in these assets. Now, as the value of those assets has fallen in the market, and that's a market force that has done it, they obviously had no control over it. Their wealth has declined. which means their ability to be able to live a certain standard of living over a period of time has been adversely affected. In other words, they'll have to save more in order to be able to rebuild their assets to a position where the returns from the assets will then be able to restore the level of consumption that they wanted to maintain before the crisis took place. What I'm trying to emphasize here is the market forces have made a large number of people lose a part of their wealth. It has disappeared.
Now, not only in the United States, or is this globally?
It's global. It's global. Even in countries, in the oil-producing countries, in the Gulf, which have very small populations, yes, it has happened. Take the case of Kuwait. The stock market in Kuwait has fallen by over 35% so far this year.
Wow.
And that has led to a major crisis for a very large number of average income Kuwaitis. I mean, some of the relatively rich Kuwaitis I don't think have had too much of a problem, even though they lost it too. But the problem is there was a very large number of middle class Kuwaiti nationals who lost their personal savings in the process. Now, what do? Where do they go to recoup that? Should they go to the government and demand the government should make up for that? No. The government has no responsibility to do that. You are dealing in the market. You have lost in the market. The government cannot do anything about it. The government may like to go in and help out by just being the government, and therefore is concerned about the well-being of its citizens.
Well,
they like to go.
What about projects that happen inside the country, like an effort to rebuild our failing infrastructure?
Stop.
Would that help the government if the government were to put money into the economy?
Yeah, that will help.
So, George,
you see, what it does is that when you introduce greater government spending on the, for example, the rebuilding of infrastructure, it generates two things. First, it generates employment immediately. But second, which is even more important, is it develops new capital in the country, which is fundamental for the future growth in the economy.
Well, I have to ask the million-dollar question. The Constitution of the United States basically gave us our founding fathers, they laid out three different type of money systems, if you will. One was that was given to the states that was basically gold as money, and the gold, between the states, and that's, what people used. The second one, I think it was Section 1, Section A, Article 8 said that the United States, I understand it to be the corporate body, would borrow the money, which seems to be what we're doing now, because we borrow the money from the Federal Reserve centralized banking system. Yet there was one more avenue of approach, and that was that the Congress would coin the money and determine the value thereof. And so my thought is this: why do nation states? Why do we go to this banking system that we have to pay interest back to? Isn't it in the interest of various countries to have their treasury coin the money and determine the value thereof? Why doesn't that happen?
Well, look, many reasons. First of all, money, what you call money that is coined, for example, is such a small component of the total liquidity in the system.
Or printed, right? So it's digital. In other words,
well, we're talking about credit creation here.
Credit creation is really the money.
Yes,
not the currency itself. Yeah. Currency is such a small component of the total, not even 10% of the total money supply in the system. So, from that point of view, the issue of currency as such is a relatively unimportant issue. Currency is just a very simple, plain transactions. It's a unit of account, as you may call it. It's not a store of money. It's not a store of wealth anymore. Right. So under those circumstances, it's not something that you have to worry too much about. I wouldn't even be concerned about that. It really doesn't matter whether the states have this right or the federal government has the right. Much of the money, as we call it, is being generated in the private sector, not in the government sector.
Well, that's the Federal Reserve. Isn't that a private-public partnership?
No.
That wouldn't be considered private?
Because what does the Federal Reserve do?
They loan the money?
Only when there is a need for it by the banks on a very short-term basis. The banks create their own money by taking deposits and then creating credit against those deposits.
Yeah, they actually have the power to create
Yes,
credit then.
yes.
So
Exactly.
most of the credit in the country is created by private organizations.
Entirely by them. Entirely.
So do you think? I think the question she posed: would it be better if the Treasury started creating that credit directly?
No. I tell you what.
And that way there would not be a burden of debt on that credit creation. That's a proposal. Would that help the economy?
No, for two reasons. First of all, the Treasury doesn't know where the credit needs to be developed, which sectors, which individual, how much. That is something the market determines. The Treasury cannot determine it. The Treasury doesn't have the capacity to determine it. It will become almost like a communist system if the Treasury were to start to decide how much money should be created and how should it be created.
So the point you're making here is if you get back to a Treasury credit creation model, right, a direct credit, creation, but then it would be more socialistic or communistic, and it would take away that. But now, where does then the private sector has a monopoly of credit creation? Cannot that develop into a very dictatorial type of system?
No, because you see, look.
Because money is power, right? Credit creation is power.
But look at it this way. Look at the number of banks that are there in the United States. They're all competing with each other to generate credit and lend. Okay? So they can't really have dictatorial power. They're all competing with each other.
But is there not a consolidation into a fewer number of institutions?
Not really.
It looks like some of the largest banks are buying out the smaller ones all the time. Now, the real fear here, it looks like to me, is that this bailout money is being used to support the largest of institutions to buy out those smaller ones or to dominate the smaller ones.
But that's something which is very difficult to explain at this moment because it's much too soon. We don't really know which way it's going to go. However, I can see one thing. You see, running a banking system as massive as the US banking system, you may need to look at only the large banks which have the potential to create the largest problem. If you can handle them,
Yeah.
make sure
Regulatory
as well as to make sure that they've got adequate capital so that they don't get into trouble.
Okay, do you think, though, that during this regulation period they were not adequately regulated? There's some criticism under the George Bush last 8 years almost that they did not regulate and did not closely scrutinize those financial institutions closely enough. Is that right?
I've heard of that.
Yeah.
I cannot say that myself.
As a result, it even made this crisis worse. Some of the
I know what you're saying.
Assertions are being made.
Assertions, but that's my point.
Yeah.
We have to be very careful about accepting the assertions.
Well, you need scientific and quantified.
You do need to do analytical work on it to come to the right kind of conclusion. Reason being.
But would a reasonable man reach a conclusion based upon some? If you look the other way, these corporations are going to be more likely to do as they please. And would the normal greed and so forth and unregulated atmosphere grow a problem instead of making a stronger institution with the derivatives thrown in there and the characteristic of the speculation was great. In other words, my view that I see that the lenders. Well, I made my first loan when I was 16 years old. And the banks then were more solid, and they stuck more to lending, and they knew their borrowers better. Today, they're more corporate in nature, and they're bigger, and of course, and maybe they have come through a period of deregulation and non-scrutiny that was not good for them, or good for the consumer in the end.
But I guess that's one of the reasons why the summit asked for more rigorous and more coordinated regulation.
So that would indicate possibly that in the past few decades here, then they were not closely enough scrutinized.
Again, I've got a problem with that. The reason, although at one level I also accept what you're saying.
Yes, okay. To some degree, you could agree with that,
but then,
statement to some percentage. Or
I know, but then you start to wonder You see, trained as an economist, I would not like to take an assertion or a point of view as conclusion.
Without facts, right?
One needs to undertake analysis to come to a conclusion.
Well, we're some old good old boys from Texas by way of Minnesota, so we can jump to conclusions.
It's fine.
I guess everybody wants to jump to conclusions they support, right?
Everybody's paying attention. Everybody's really curious.
Now, Doctor, do you think that this crisis, though, is creating a conversation about money and banking that we didn't have 20 years ago, 10 years ago in this country?
Isn't it good?
I think it's good to do that. I mean, we're out here reporting tonight in your home, and you're very gracious in inviting us into your home to try to maintain or to attain a greater truth of what's really going on. And that's really what we're about, and I think you're a man of truth also.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't jump to conclusions. I would rather that solid objective analysis is undertaken to determine what went wrong. What were the factors that caused it, and then how can we address the problem? It's over. It's done. I mean, the problem is there.
It exists. It is here, right? I mean, we have this problem.
Now understand what caused it, and then see how we can address it. I think there is a reasonably good movement how to address it. The question is how soon it's going to be addressed.
You seem to imply earlier in the interview that potentially this could actually be good for the United States in that we're one of the deficit. And so potentially, what I heard you say, sir, was potentially our manufacturing base. If we could muster our American ingenuity, the Small Business Administration is giving out loans, perhaps we can return to more of a balanced economy, not so much a service economy, but we get some manufacturing, maybe some more better agricultural, situations. It's time to change, so that we can,
That's true. That's true. I think, look, the whole world is going to be saner and better down the road. This is what you could call a real scare, and a scare with a reasonably good basis to it. It's different from the way it was in the 1930s, because in the 1930s the authorities really didn't understand what the problem was, number one. Number two, they didn't have the instruments to handle it. Today we are in a position to understand better. We have the instruments to handle it. And third, which is probably the most important, everybody recognizes it. And there is global cooperation to handle the problem. In the 1930s, there was no such thing as global cooperation. The famous term, beggar thy neighbor, was very much practiced. Today, I don't think it will happen. And that's the reason why you see some of the relatively less developed countries like Brazil, China, and India were invited in to participate, because the concern is it's a global problem. You can't handle it without everybody being part of it. And everybody has to chip in. I mean, otherwise the whole world economy suffers. And the whole world economy suffers, that poverty increases.
Well, let me ask you this final question. I don't know how our time is doing, but considering the Bank of International Settlements, I recently saw a diagram, and it showed me visually where the Bank of International Settlements is, and it's pretty far extensive all over the globe.
Very powerful institution, is it not?
Well, it's a central bank.
So it clears
the central bank's transactions.
Yes, transactions. So it is a very powerful institution, is it not?
How do you?
I wouldn't say that. I tell you why I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
It is only as powerful as central banks would let it be. At this moment, it's a good place for the central banks to get together, talk over things, use the secretariat of the BIS to provide them with the technical, analytical foundations to work on. And that's it. BIS itself is not an institution that can take on responsibility, because first of all, it doesn't lend to the countries. Number two, it doesn't have the staff. Number three, it never was in an area where you could call that it was for firefighting purposes. It was never created for that purpose. So it's a good institution for whatever it does, but what it does is very limited.
I see. So, but as we go to resolve, as the global people come together and the leadership, the BIS might get a little more action in the
I would
next
hope so.
couple of years?
I would hope so. Because you see, don't forget that central banks have to cooperate with each other. We can't pretend that they will not cooperate and results would get better. No. You have to have more cooperation in order for things to be resolved sooner and in a better way. And BIS does provide a very fundamental foundation on which these central banks get together.
Okay.
So in that sense, it's a very good institution, and I would expect it to have.
Do you see a diminishing, Doctor, of the nation state and an amalgamation into a new world order, a new world government that some envision anytime soon?
Or just a world economic system, a more a de facto world currency.
Through this new structure that is being perhaps put together in the future, in the near future, do you see that will give rise to some new world order or some new world government?
Well, I'm not sure whether they will give rise to a new world government, but certainly give rise to a new economic order where the interdependence of countries will be recognized. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it will be also recognized that all the countries have to be given their due responsibility for the world economy to sustain itself. Whether it will lead to a diminution of the nation state, hard to tell. It depends upon individual countries, really. I mean, if countries don't wish it to happen, it won't happen. When it comes to the issue of whether there's going to be a single global currency, from my point of view, it's already there. Because, look at it this way, the currencies are transacted in the free market. There's a certain exchange rate that is determined in the free market by forces of supply and demand. Mm-hmm. In other words, no individual country is in a position to establish the value of its currency different from what the market would fetch. Only maybe for a short period of time, but then you suffer, you lose your reserves in order to protect a certain exchange rate. After a point, you give up. The market takes over. So from the point of view of the global market, there's actually already one currency. You may give it different names. You may give it dollar, euro, whatever, but to the extent that they're all convertible with each other and at interest exchange rates that are determined in the market, it doesn't really matter whether you're holding dollars or you're holding euros. The only difference is if you expect that euros are going to appreciate in the future and not the dollar, you like to move towards the euro, which would then mean that the price of euro will go up. It will become more difficult to hold the euro, and in the process, the dollar will become cheaper. You would like to hold it. The interest rate in the case of the dollar will go up, which will then pull the dollar back up. So the reality is that whether you like it or not, national currencies are only legally so. In real operational sense, there is no such thing as the hegemony of any national currency.
How long do you forecast, or in your crystal ball, do you see this recession we're in the United States proceeding and being resolved? What period of time do you think that we can turn this?
What's your hope?
What's your hope?
What's your hope?
That's truly crystal ball gazing.
I know, our crystal balls are broken too.
We didn't bring it with us tonight, okay? We left it.
Now that's a very big if.
Yeah.
If the grand design for global economic reform goes into effect in the next 6 months, and that you have a new framework in place before the next annual meetings, which will take place in September 2009. Mm-hmm. I would expect that the turnaround will come sometimes around the middle of 2010.
Okay.
And that, of course, requires the major prerequisite, and that major prerequisite is significantly higher spending in the United States and in other countries of the world as well, financed by the surpluses of countries which have those surpluses, like China, Japan.
Wow. And what
integration.
Now you're Pakistani. That's your home country. What is happening in the region now, and what in the near future? Are there problems between the Afghanistan border and the Pakistani border? What's happening in your opinion there, and how is that going to resolve the conflict in that area there?
I'm really not in a position to say anything on that because that's
Okay.
a domain that I don't really know much about. But I
Okay.
can tell you is only one thing.
What is your personal opinion?
But there is an economic basis to every conflict that exists in the world. And its lack of growth in that region over the last 2 decades, which has caused the problem. If the economies were growing well and people had stake in that growth, I can assure you there will be much less conflict. The conflicts take on different colors because that's the way people rally people around. Either they use religion or they use any other attack, but underlying all this is the issue of how much access they have to the resources, economic resources. If you're poor, you have nothing to lose. If by doing something you can get a little bit more. So in the final analysis, the solution really lies in the economic growth of the region. I mean, Afghanistan is poor. I mean, it's hard to even comprehend the degree of poverty that exists. It's poor. I mean, it's so poor that unless you see it, you can't visualize how poor it is. If that economy were to grow and people get a stake, why do you think there is so much production of opium over there? Because that's what provides them with a livelihood.
That's a lot of the activity, the economic activity. Now, has that been going on for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, right?
Well, but in very small amounts in the past.
But now it's getting up into bigger amounts.
Essentially because there's no alternative source of livelihood.
I see.
It's poverty.
So the cash crop are the poppies over there, and many of the out. I know I saw some UN photographs, aerial shots, satellites that showed that when the conflict was underway with American forces there in great number, that they just started growing it in different areas. The satellites seemed to indicate they just moved into different areas and growing it away from the areas of conflict. So some have estimated that oil revenues are the greatest revenue in the world, and drug revenue is the second one in the world. Would you? Could that be? It's up there. I mean,
it's possible, but the fact of the matter is that unless you have numbers, you can't.
Right.
You can't analyze it.
But I mean, and so in this country today, you're saying that we possibly could expect a possible turnaround mid-2010,
yes.
Maybe something like that. We're going to see a greater number of homes foreclosed, in your opinion, things like that, or are we reaching a high number already? Right?
Well, if the system is run well, I think it will be possible to avoid that from happening. To the extent that the banks have got greater degree of maneuverability as funds are provided to them by the government bailout scheme, they ought to be able to handle it. But again, who knows?
Do you think that the money under the bailout, legislation that was passed, is being administered in a proper way, or
I really don't know.
You haven't looked at that?
It's one of those things that I really don't know much about.
Because actually, the population, the American public and the voting public, I think they were very muchly against that bill, period, from what I could tell. And they expressed that, I think, to most of their representatives and senators in Congress.
It's always a problem.
Yeah.
See, when you think about $750 billion being used and you're not sure what they're being used for, you're going to have doubts. But from my point of view, you have to spend a lot of money right now to protect the economy from going into a tailspin.
So the creation of these credits, either by the Fed or by true tax monies like the bailout, in your opinion, are needed just to keep it from going into
Yes.
a real crash,
Yes.
a real crash and burn, or a depression, a major depression.
Famous. This is where the difference lies, as I said, between what's happening today and what happened in the 1930s.
Now, when can the real economy, the physical economy, there's real production. Is that a key to bringing this thing back? And there is a lot of invention going on in the alternative fuel, energy sector. So can that be a factor that will help us?
Certainly.
Yeah, and the American get up and go and innovation and inventiveness. That could also be a turnaround. Now, this industry that was taken offshore, much of it to China, has really hurt our economy.
Well, look at it this way. You see, but you have to realize, why did it happen?
Yes.
They had difficulty in maintaining that industry over here in a competitive fashion.
Yeah.
You see, that's what I mean. Today we have a world which is totally integrated. If you do not get adequate return to your effort here, you'll go elsewhere. And the same happens for countries, investors elsewhere who have come to the United States. This is the, how should I say it, the miracle of the global integrated market.
Mm-hmm. So America, we had kind of perceived that, when you bought a piece of real estate, it should double in value.
Exactly.
And that's it. But if you had a stable currency and a stable economy, then the value would actually be pretty constant.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No.
Depends on supply and demand and other factors. But we came to depend on this concept that all of our assets are continuing to appreciate.
Yes, that was the problem, and that what it did was that it tended to make you less concerned about savings.
Right.
Because you assumed that you had enough wealth to be able to generate income down the road without saving now.
Right. Well, so would I be correct in saying that money is going to be tight for the average consumer because they need to pay their debt off? And so we can't, you only have so much coming in. You're going to have to pay your debt. That will be priority, and then hopefully some savings. So it's going to be a rough.
It's going to be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the reason why the government has to do more.
Mm-hmm.
Whether one likes it or not, that's the only, how should I say it, instrument left or agent left that can do it, can pull the economy up.
Mm-hmm.
Individuals have a problem now.
Mm-hmm. So when President Bush gave those tax credits last year, there were only a few $100s, per person. But in theory, that type of action, would it literally be the government giving individuals money?
No, it doesn't have to.
Mm-hmm.
It can go and spend it on its own. There's so many projects out there. I mean, look at the quality of the infrastructure.
Okay.
With the rebuilding of bridges
Yes.
and major capital
Yes.
projects,
Because the advantage of
that would infuse it directly into the economy.
And more than that, because
Yeah.
down the road it will help, because it will improve the productivity of private sector investment down the road, because you'll have this capital which will be more efficient and allow better investment by the private sector.
And we would be creating tangible things too
course.
out of it, versus
Of
we'd be
course.
taking credits and creating real, what I mean, objects here,
Yeah.
physical economy directly.
So we should put on our seatbelts and expect more spending from the Congress?
Well, let me put it this way. As an economist, what I can say is more spending would be better than less spending at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
How to spend that is a different issue.
Right. Now, what happens on the street, if you will, at the microeconomic level, people become panicked because they feel like that is their debt. Now it's going to be taken out of them some way in the future through taxation, through some way the government is going to get that money back out of them. And a lot of Americans are very concerned about that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So I think earlier in our conversation, you did say the consumer would suffer in this. The individual would.
Hey, look,
Worldwide. It's not just the
they've
American.
already lost their homes and all their equity.
if your
homes.
wealth
Yeah.
declines and you have a certain objective with regard to your consumption down the road, what do? You either work more or you consume less right now, so that you can generate more savings and therefore rebuild your wealth that is then going to generate income that you need down the road to live off.
Yeah. You know, Thomas Jefferson once said that financial institutions were more dangerous than standing armies. Could that be what we're seeing here? We're seeing very, very large organizations worldwide that are gaining more. There's more concentration into fewer hands. It looks
Well,
like.
if the regulatory practice is going to affect as is planned,
Yeah.
then that won't be the case.
Yeah. We just broadcast from George Mason yesterday.
Yes.
We had a special program out there, and so George Mason and Thomas Jefferson were contemporaries, you know,
Right.
and they based much of the Now, how far away from the Constitution has this country, you know, moved? Are we pretty far away from that now?
I've not read the American Constitution in that sense, so I really don't know what to say.
Okay, because we were just wondering what your sense of what your opinion would be on that. Okay, was there anything else, Sean?
Let's see. I think well, we covered the depression again. If just in a closing and summary, why is what we're going through in the next potentially 2 years, year and a half? Why is this not like the 1930s?
Well, three reasons this matter. One of those is that we have better instruments in the hands of the government to address the credit crisis as is happening right now. At that time, during the Depression era, the Federal Reserve actually withdrew credit from the system. It reduced liquidity in the system. It raised interest rate. And the same thing happened in the rest of the world as well. So actually, they discouraged spending, which worsened the crisis. Second was that the governments themselves contracted their spending because their revenues were falling. Third, countries turned against each other. There was no global action to address the problem, and it was a global problem. So what they did was that to protect themselves, they introduced protectionist practices, tariff restrictions, quota restrictions, in order to keep imports out so as to create market for domestically produced goods and therefore increase employment. Now, what it did was that actually it reduced the standard of living of people. And if the economy, global economy, contracted largely because of these protectionist policies rather than grow as was assumed. That's the reason why since then, the smooth holidays, there's been persistent movement towards stabilization.
Right. You know, that, and this will be my final question. Okay, back to the concept. So the government is going to spend its way out of this. That looks like all the governments of the world are going to start spending, which is actually borrowing because it's credit. Okay, and then there's going to be interest to be paid back to, I guess, the World Bank, the IMF, or not the IMF. Well, except for some people, right? What about interest, debit, forgiveness? Why can't the money just come out? Why does it have to be approved? Because it seems to me it sets up a dynamic of it compromises the consumers. Credit, like before we came on camera, we started discussing, credit's important to our livelihood, like water, it's something that's very, on a micro level, it's very important. And when you have to, that constant taking back from the consumer, whether it's through taxation or, these interest payments, why not debit, why not interest forgiveness? Why not get the money into circulation and get the system rolling? Why does it have to go back in that capacity?
Well, the consumer is a saver as well. And a saver defers his consumption in order to generate that saving and put it into the bank. The bank has to pay the saver for using those savings. That's the interest. If the bank doesn't earn that interest and forgives that interest to the borrower, then it cannot pay the consumer who has saved and put the money in the banking system. And the banking system will actually collapse.
Okay, so when a person saves, let's say, very few people will put a lot of money in the bank and savings.
Supposing I will give you an example.
Well, today I think Americans are not net savers, Dan.
No.
Yeah, I know.
Japanese have been so
Well,
it's just been some of our problems, but
That's the problem.
But have we not through inflation seen a decline of the purchasing power of the dollar?
Because of real estate?
Not really.
Because of...
Not really, because you see, when you think about it, the imports have become so cheap.
Yeah.
that the real income of consumers has actually gone up when you measure it in terms
But
of
we have
the
lost
prices.
manufacturing jobs that did pay
That's a different
higher wages. say.
Because what we have done is this, that we have shifted from manufacturing to service industry.
To service industries at lower wage levels, probably.
No, not necessarily. It's just that for the service industries, you need a different kind of skill.
Yes.
So the skills of a manufacturing activity cannot be transferred to the service industry.
Right.
So there is a
So we're in the
discontinuity.
process of acquiring some.
Transition
of
is
these
taking place. It's a bit longer than one would have expected, but it's taking place.
Okay, I have my follow. This is my last question. So the bank is paying interest to the saver,
Right.
but didn't they create the credit out of thin air in the first place?
No.
I thought we worked on a fractional reserve banking
Still,
system.
but it's a fraction doesn't mean that you're creating 10 times more credit than the deposits.
You are creating more credit
Yeah.
than reserve that you have on
Maybe
the bank.
200, maybe
Yeah.
twice as
So,
much.
so
it
they
all
are
depends.
creating credits.
Yeah.
Some would maintain,
But,
in that
you know-
way. But that's the power then of banking, right?
Sure, because
Okay.
see, this is a product
Sure.
that you're creating.
Yeah.
You have
so-
put an effort into creating that product.
Yeah.
So you earn a return on that. And that part of the return is paid to the saver against whose savings the credit was created. So if you were to not collect interest on your lending, you won't be able to pay your savers. Then the whole system will break down. Unfortunately.
Well, this was a very
Well-
fascinating interview, sir.
Dr. Iqbal, thank you very much this evening
you.
for this interview, and thank you very much for inviting us into your home. And that tea, I think, was pretty good, wasn't it?
Delicious, thank you.
Charles,
Your
Jim, thank you
generosity
for that
and
tea, and your generosity, and your
Expertise and
hospitality,
information.
especially. We're going to be signing off in approximately 2 minutes. We're going silent here in about 30 seconds. I'm George Butler with World Review Commentary, along with my co-host this evening.
Charlotte Littlefield Brown.
And we profusely thank Dr. Iqbal for inviting us here and giving us a fine interview this evening. So thank you very much for viewing this production. So good night.
Thank you.